Um, and there you go. Okay. So we are very excited, and I appreciate Kathy joining us today. Kathy is a communications trainer. She's a public affairs strategist, and she's a writer with a particular interest in international assignments. Kathy has traveled all over the world to do election monitoring, and she has served as a public affairs director for an international nonprofit specializing in democracy building executives, and as executive vice president of an international public affairs firm advising corporations, organizations, and foreign governments. Kathy is the immediate past chairman and current board member of the National Press Foundation. She's also worked as a public affairs strategist and trainer for the, sorry, I lost my place on my notes. She's also worked as a public affairs strategist, trainer, and editor, as well as a writer. And Kathy worked on the Hill as well. And she was the press secretary for Senator William Cohen for about 9 years. In addition, she's been the executive vice president of Powell and Tate. So Kathy has a lot of experience in DC as well as across oceans and borders. And we really appreciate her joining us this evening and sharing this information with us. I'm looking forward to a fascinating presentation. Kathy, the room is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that nice introduction. So I'm going to talk about international election observation to distinguish it from observation here in the United States, which I don't have a lot of experience in. And the organizations that I've worked for generally do not and are not allowed to operate in the United States. So this is aimed particularly at international things. So I wanted to just sort of set the scene here. So I've observed 23 elections so far. I hope to do more in 12 countries. And this map shows the different places where I've been. As you'll see, the most elections that I've observed have been in Ukraine. If you look at the list on the left, which makes me particularly sad about what's going on in Ukraine these days. But I've been to a number of other places as well, 4 times in Georgia, 2 in Afghanistan, twice in Albania. Interestingly, the first election I observed was in Albania in 1996, and the last one I observed was also in Albania. So I kind of come full circle, I guess. So the reason their election observation is a thing, I guess you could say, is because as the number of democracies in the world have grown, so has the call for observers. The majority of the world's countries now are democracies. This map shows you the changes that have taken place in the 40 years between 1997 and 2017. The blue shows the countries that are democratic. The sort of dark yellow is autocratic countries, and the lighter colors are sort of mixed. But as you can see, there have been enormous changes, for example, in South America, also in Africa, which was previously mostly autocratic and has now made progress toward some democracy. Anyway, but there has been backsliding, of course. In '89, when the Berlin Wall came down, obviously that was a time when more countries started to move toward democracy. But the number has shrunk in recent years, since 2015, from 104 to 98 democracies, according to International IDEA, which is a democracy organization. So the reason people want more observers is because they believe that through transparency, it makes them more legitimate, which is true sometimes, but not always. So, but that's why countries invite observers in, is they feel that by having more people observe their elections, it gives them a chance for people to think they are legitimate elections, some of which are not so legitimate. But also, so it's important to note that the people who observe elections actually come from all over the world. And there are a number of regional organizations that make it a point of observing elections that are in their spheres of influence. So the European Union, excuse me, often sends observers, the Council of Europe, the Organization of American States, which operates in South America, the African Union, and there are many others. And then there are a number of US organizations that observe elections. So the Carter Center, Freedom House, the International Republican Institute, and the National Democratic Institute. I worked for NDI for many years. And we often did election observation on our own and sometimes in conjunction with IRI. There are 4 organizations that are under the umbrella kind of the National Endowment for Democracy. NDI and IRI are 2 of them. So they have a lot in common and they sometimes team up on things. And also embassies, US embassies in different countries will send delegations out to observe. This picture, the point of it is mostly to show that people like having observers. So this lady, this is in Pakistan, and the lady in the middle, of course, is Pakistani, and she's quite happy that she has observers in her polling station. Now, most of the people who observe elections actually do not come from abroad. Most of them are people who live in the country where the election is taking place. And they represent political parties, different civic organizations, human rights groups. This particular picture is in Ukraine, Dnipro, which is an area that is actually very close to Donetsk and Luhansk, which is where all of the Russian activity has been taking place. When I was there, which was I think in 2015 or 16, I've been back to Ukraine since then, but only in Dnipro during that period. There was already turmoil going on in the what's known as the Donbass region, which is the far east of Ukraine, closest to Russia. But anyway, the people who are sitting here, you can notice they all have tags on. They have to be registered with the government, and the tags will say who they represent. And they basically sit there all day and they take notes and they pay attention to what's going on and report back to their organizations. So what do observers do? People ask me this all the time. What do you do as an observer? So the simple answer is you observe. You report on what you see, but your job is not to tell people what to do. But in order to prepare for this, you have to understand what's going on in the country. You need to study the election laws so that you know kind of how people are supposed to behave. And you visit a bunch of polling stations on election day, and you watch what's going on both inside and outside. And then you report back, you record this and you report back. This picture here is from the Republic of Georgia. And there's often a lot of stuff that kind of goes on outside of polling stations. People, there sometimes are people from political parties and other organizations that will be outside and will be checking off who went in and who came out, things like that. I think it's a little intimidating. They may be checking up on people who they expect to vote a certain way and they wonder if they did. I was in Albania, one of my visits to Albania, there was a whole contingent of soldiers who came in to vote at a particular polling station, and they would check with their commanding officer as they left, presumably to tell him that how they voted or what they did. Anyway, this sort of thing happens a lot, and it's not necessarily the way things should be, but you have to deal with what is. So, how do you prepare for this? So usually you go to the capital city of whatever the country is, and you get a couple of days of briefings in the capital city on procedures, what the election procedures are, what the election law says, and also on the politics of what's going on. Now, different organizations do this in different ways. So NDI, where I observed, for whom I observed a number of elections, spends a lot of time backgrounding its observers on the politics in the country, sort of what's going on and what's the undercurrent and what are people trying to accomplish. NDI's delegations usually are somewhere between 30 and 50 people. The largest one I ever was on, I think, was 80 people, which was a combined delegation with the Carter Center, which included Jimmy Carter in the West Bank in 2006. The OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, is completely different. So the last observation delegation I was on for them had 600 people who were sent out all around the country. As you'll see here, people go out in teams. So there's usually 2 observers in a team, a driver from the local area who presumably knows where he's going, or she. I've never had a she, but most of them are men, and a translator. So of course, most of us don't speak the languages of the places where we get sent. So a translator is very important. Usually the teams are paired in sort of in ways that complement each other. So it might be a man and a woman. They would not be from the same country. Usually people are from varied countries, and they're of different ages and levels of experience. So my last trip to Albania, which was in 2019, I was paired with a young man from Moldova who, I mean, I'm probably old enough to be his grandmother, and he was thrilled to be doing this. He had never done it before. And he was taken with the paper. There's a lot of paperwork that goes with this because you have to fill out all these forms to record what you see. And he was thrilled to be doing the paperwork, which I thought was, this is great. So anyway, so we spent a lot of time together and got along very well. And that's important, is to get along with your partner and kind of talk about what you're doing and what you're seeing. Because the reports that you file one report per team. So it's kind of important that you agree with each other on what you're looking at. So you are deployed after the 2 days of briefings in the Capitol. Usually you're deployed a day or 2 before the election to the local area in the country where you will be observing. Some of these areas are miles and miles from the Capitol, so you have to either fly there or take a train there. Sometimes they're closer, so you would drive there. And occasionally you get sent to someplace that's very close to the Capitol, so you would come back and spend the night. But for the most part, you spend the night in the areas, or a couple of nights actually, in the areas where you're going to be observing. So in these days before the election, you look at the setup of how the polling stations have been arranged. So up in the corner here, this is a picture from Ukraine. And these are ballot boxes that have been set up. This is a large polling station, so they have all these ballot boxes. And you can see the polling booths behind. Blue and yellow, as you may know from the news, are the colors of Ukraine. And so these are well set. This is a well set up polling station where people will be able to vote in private. In Egypt, on the bottom picture, this is how the ballots usually arrive, wrapped in brown paper, which is kind of common the world over. And they are brought to the polling stations. They have to be counted and registered and all sorts of things like that. And they come the day before, so there has to be someone whose job it is to make sure that they are secure overnight. And there's usually they put them in a locked room somewhere, and there's a guard or somebody is assigned to be there with the ballots and to make sure that nothing happens to them. So when you're in these places, in these cities, you have to visit the party headquarters, you visit some polling stations to see how things are set up. You meet with local election officials, and this is important because you'll be talking to them as the election progresses. And you try to meet as many people who can be helpful to you on election day as you're trying to figure out what's going on as the vote proceeds. So on election day, you pick a polling station to watch the setup. And it's very important to see that they're set up properly. So in one of these, in the second bullet here, you'll see, so the question is, are the ballot boxes, are they sealed? Are the ballots secure? Are there voting lists in place? Are all of the personnel present? There are different countries that have different laws, but there's usually maybe 8 or 10 people who have to be there. There are the ballot clerks, there's the people who check in voters, there's occasionally in some countries people get their fingers are inked after they have voted. And so somebody has to be in charge of the ink, that kind of thing. In Egypt, I was at a polling station. I was there on the first election after the Arab Spring. And the guy at my polling station was very nervous that I was there and watching him. And he asked me if I would leave because I was making him nervous. So I left briefly because I didn't want to cause an international incident, but I did come back after not too long because obviously that was my job. But it's you have to kind of play it by ear, and you don't want people to feel uncomfortable. Most of the time they're glad you're there, but they act like they're on their best behavior. So when you're sitting in a polling station, usually you try to fade into the woodwork. So you usually should spend at least a half an hour in each polling station. You might visit somewhere between 10 and 12 during the day, but you want to stay there long enough that they kind of forget about you and you can kind of see how things are going on. The other thing you do on election day is once the ballots are cast, they're usually counted in polling stations, and then they are brought to the central election office in whatever city it is. And this picture is after the ballots. You can see these bags of ballots here on the front, in front of the dais. And this is the local election board, and they are voting to accept the ballots that someone has brought there and has reported to them what they saw. So you look for things like, is it calm? Is it orderly? Are people being intimidated? Are they able to vote in secret? So these pictures in Nigeria, where they are not quite as rigorous as they are in Ukraine in finding polling booths that are secret, you can see here this guy on the bottom shouldn't be looking over the shoulder of this voter here to see who he voted for. That is way out of line. And of course, this lady at the top, we can't see anyone looking at her, but obviously her voting booth allows people to look over her shoulder and see what she's doing. So it's not an ideal way of doing things. And of course, all of this is reported on your paperwork that you send in. So looking at the procedures, are they being followed? People usually have to present an ID. Well, here, let me move on to some places where you can actually see what's going on. This was in Albania in 2019. The map, you probably can't see it, but there's a little red dot in the middle of the map, which shows where this place is. So you can see the ballot boxes at the top. They're getting ready to open them, to count them. At the bottom here on the left, this fellow he's the guy who's in charge of looking at the ballot boxes to make sure nobody tampers with them. In the middle here, you can see people checking in to vote. And so their names are checked off of a list. They have to present an ID. They usually have to sign for the ballot. You'll see some more pictures later. And so that helps kind of, so people know who voted, and of course, no one is supposed to vote who is not on the list. And then the counting of the votes takes place, as I said, in the polling station. But then these people in orange are local election officials in Liberia. And the votes are, you can see the ballot boxes here on the lower right. So people bring the ballot boxes to this central election place. And I don't know if you can notice, but here, these are screens. And when the ballots are counted, each ballot is opened and looked at because they're sort of recounted. It goes up on the screen. So it's supposed to be a transparent process. So people are can look and see what the ballots say. And some people keep track, others wait for the tallies at the end. But it gives you an idea of kind of how they do this. This is Cherkasy, Ukraine, is a town. Well, you can see this map up here in the upper left, is also in the middle of Ukraine. It's on a river, and it's actually quite pretty. I included a few pictures that aren't election related, but on the bottom here, there are fields and fields of sunflowers. We were in a bus going to Cherkasy from Kyiv, the capital, and it's just mile after mile of these sunflowers. It's quite beautiful. This is the main square over here on the left of Cherkasy. Across the street from this very, I think, beautiful building is the Opera House. And outside the Opera House was this amazing statue of this woman playing a violin sitting on a wire. It's obviously a statue. And I just thought it was so remarkable that I had to take a picture of it. But anyway, here, these are pictures of, in the middle here, of people who are checking in to vote. And you can see here, right here, there are people, this guy is presenting his ID for the election officials to look at. And so they're all being checked off. And they get, once they check in, they go to the next station and they get a ballot from the election clerk. And then they go into one of these voting booths and they mark their ballot, and then they put them in one of those ballot boxes that you saw. This picture up here on the upper right is, as the ballot boxes are opened, they dump, at the end of the day, they dump out all of the ballots and they begin to count them. It's quite a process, and it's done in different ways in different countries. But the fact that they have people, not just us, but the local observers sitting there watching this process helps to make it transparent. So you get a very different scene in Liberia, which is the only polling place I've ever been where you had to have lamps because there was no electricity in the polling stations. I encountered this in Nigeria as well, but in Nigeria, all of the work is done in daylight. So it was not necessary in the rural areas to all of the counting. It's done completely transparently with people opening these ballot boxes, holding up the ballots and reading off what it says. And the crowd sort of participates and comments, and it's quite a process. But anyway, these guys up here in the upper left are going over the ballots and recording what happened. Down here, outside, in most countries, outside the polling station is this kind of list, which shows all of the people who are running. Pardon me. And so people are checking this list to remind themselves who the candidates are, who they want to vote for, that sort of thing. This in the middle here is a polling station in a little tiny village in Liberia. And you can see they have all the requisite things. They have the ballot boxes here. People go behind these curtains to vote. And these are the people who check them in, and these are the observers. So they're all here. It's just in a very kind of small area. And this is people, once it's necessary to take the ballot someplace, they get loaded onto trucks and they get taken to the Central Election Commission. I happened to be there on Christmas, and this Christmas tree was created by one of the local office holders in Bomi County, which is about, well, you can see here where it is. It's not very far from Monrovia, which is the capital. It was about a 2.5, 3-hour drive. And so he had put this together for all of the local kids. Interestingly, this Christmas tree was lit. It does have lights, but it was lit for maybe an hour for the entire time. Obviously, you can see the wires here for electrical poles, but it's not something that's used very regularly. So anyway, In Georgia, Gori, Georgia is an interesting place. It is the home, or was the home, of Stalin. Stalin was from Gori, Georgia. And so there is a big museum there for Stalin. One interesting thing about it is you would never know by going to this museum that Stalin did anything bad. Everything that Stalin did, according to this museum, was just great. This woman here, this was our little team. Henrik is a Swedish professor. So he and I were paired, and this was our translator, who happened to work at her day job was working at the Stalin Museum. So after the election, she gave us a tour, which was very interesting. Anyway, here you can see, this is the counting process here again. There are all these women lined up, making piles of ballots. And as you can see, they're different colors. So it depends on what office it is. It might be, the mayor might be pink, the city councilman might be green. It's just depending on what the election is. And of course, these are people you meet or who you meet on the road. There are, in most countries, you will find campaign posters posted all over the place, and multiples of them. So this happens just to be an example. Pakistan, and in many Islamic countries, there are separate polling stations for men and women. So you can see here on the upper left, this is a women's polling station. The one below is a polling station for men. The election officials in the women's stations are all women. And for men, they are men, not surprisingly. Elections attract kids. And so in many countries, you go to a polling station and there'll be, I have another picture coming up, but there'll be just hordes of kids who are out there and who kind of like the activity and what's going on. And so they hang around. The point of this ballot here, in many countries, people can't read. And so writing down the names of the candidates, this is a ballot for council for a legislative body. So there are a lot of candidates. And so because people can't read, every candidate has a symbol. This was particularly true in Afghanistan, where I was there for parliamentary elections in 2010. And I mean, it's just pages and pages of candidates, and every one of them has a symbol. And I'm sorry this isn't bigger, but you can, I mean, they have, birds and horses and anvils and arrows and all kinds of things just to distinguish the different candidates. And so people know that they're going to look for their candidate who is represented by a hammer or something like that. Which is important. I mean, it's a way for people to be able to distinguish who they want to vote for. And this is my last slide. This is Egypt, which was in 2011, this was the first election that was held at the beginning of the Arab Spring. It was an election to elect the members of a national assembly who were then going to write a constitution. There were, of course, many elections after that until everything in Egypt fell apart and it went back to its kind of authoritarian past. But as I mentioned, these kids are just everywhere. You can see here ballots also with symbols in Egypt. This is the scene outside of the polling station. A lot of soldiers, you often have soldiers, police, different rules in different countries, but in most places, people with guns are not supposed to be in polling stations, although that occasionally is not adhered to. You can see here, this is obviously men and women separated. This is a ballot box that has been, people were very, very proud to be voting because they had never participated before in a real election where they actually felt they were voting on something that mattered. But there are guards and there are all these people whose job it is to sort of keep track of what's going on. Now, at the time in Egypt, they did not, this is the only place I've seen this, they did not count the ballots in the polling station. They instead took them to a central location. Now, I was in Luxor, which is, as you may know, is down the Nile a bit and where there are a lot of antiquities. And they had erected one of the largest tents I've ever seen. And people would, the officials from these different polling stations would bring the ballot boxes to this tent. And then the group would, from each individual polling station, would sit together and would count the ballots. And that was how that process was finished up. It turned out that process didn't last very long. And in subsequent elections, they actually counted the ballots in the polling stations and then brought the the finished result to a central location, as I mentioned, for the other, as they did in other countries. Anyway, I think I can stop there, and I would be more than happy to answer your questions. So please have at it.
Thank you, Kathy. Do you want to stop sharing your screen so you can
Sure.
see what you're asking?
I will do that. There we go.
Excellent. Thank you. This was really interesting. And I think I will take the chair's prerogative and ask the first question. And then Tony,
Sure.
I can see your hand, you're next. So my question is, as an observer, you said, you're not supposed to interfere with the election and, you're just there to observe and maybe take notes. What do you do with a case like where you saw the soldier leaning over the guy voting? How do you handle that type of thing?
Well, for the most part, you don't interfere. You just record it. And when I say there's a lot of paperwork, there is, and we fill out all these forms, different forms in different places, different kinds of things. But also there are phone conversations with the people in the Capitol who are. What I should have mentioned, what usually happens in a situation like this is the observers send in their information, and then it's all compiled and there's a report that is written. Now, the report usually will make a judgment, like this was apparently, the usual way it happens is that they made progress in a democratic way, but there are many places where improvements could be made. And so most of the reports that I've been involved in have a set of recommendations on what could be done to improve the process. And while you can't interfere. And often what happens is sometimes election officials don't know what to do because they're trained, but maybe this is the first time they've ever done this and they aren't sure what they're exactly supposed to do. So they will often ask the observers, well, what am I supposed to do now? Because we did this and we're not sure what the next step is. So our job is not to tell them, but we often usually have copies of the election law, and we can give that to them and say, here, you can probably find what you're looking for in here. But you also are, I think, need to ask questions. And the questions can be pointed, even though you're not telling people what to do. So, for example, I was in Azerbaijan observing an election, and it appeared that a lot of people came in who were turned away because their name was not on the voting list. And so finally you say, how come all these people are not on the voting list? And they may give you an idea. They were eliminated. They're in the wrong polling station. That's why their name isn't there. But it turned out in Azerbaijan, there were a lot of people who had been taken off the voting list, apparently because they were considered not to be favorable toward the ruling party, which is, as you might imagine, a no-no. And so there was a court that was in session, and people who were unhappy with what was going on at the polling station could go to the court and could ask for adjudication of their problem. So my partner and I went to the court because we wanted to see what was going on. And there was this enormous crowd out in front and all these angry people, because as you can imagine, if there are a lot of people and it's you know, there are only so many hours of the day, and how fast can the court resolve these things? So when we got there and we had our tags on and all that, and we were just swamped with people who were very angry. So we listened to them for a while, but I thought we need to get out of here because there's going to be a riot because these people are so angry. So we left, but of course we recorded all of this and we told this to our handlers who put it all in their report. In some other places, I mean, sometimes there are TV cameras in polling stations, and I mean, at one point I had some guy who was just following me around like 3 inches from my face. And every time I would say anything to anybody, he'd record it. And I finally I said, what are you doing with that? Why are you recording this? Well, I don't know. They told me to keep track or something. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that happens that doesn't have a good reason because people don't know. And in some countries, people don't have a lot of experience with excuse me, with elections. So they kind of do what they think they should do. I mean, but think about, you know, if you were in a polling station and someone was following you around with a TV camera, you'd probably not be very happy about that. So asking questions about that is certainly permissible.
Interesting. And it sounds very intimidating, frankly.
It can be very intimidating. Yeah.
Tony, I saw your hand.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. That was a fabulous talk. I had no idea it was going to be so interesting.
Oh, thank you.
I had visions of you in Indiana or some dull place like that. And I've been in Russia during elections, and I did have a couple of questions. One was, what do you do when you see truckloads of voters being hauled in clearly from other parts of the city? Is this just something you make a note of?
Pretty much. I mean, we're not in a position to, I mean, you ask a lot of questions. Who are these people? Where did they come from? Are they at this polling station? Are they on the voting list? I mean, if they're on the voting list and that's where they're supposed to be voting, then that's fine. If they're not, then of course that's another problem. So, I mean,
so you do ask a lot of questions. You
Yes.
don't just sit there and watch.
No,
Okay.
you can ask questions. And I think that's important to ask questions so that people understand, the people you're reporting to understand what you've seen and what it is, if you can find out from asking questions.
Okay. And
It's funny. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say one thing with translators, it can be hard. So some of them are experienced and understand what we're doing. Some of them aren't. And so there's an argument going on in the polling station in Albanian, and I don't know what they're talking about. So say to the translator, well, what are they arguing about? And the translator says, they're arguing about the ballots. Okay, what about the ballots? So you have to be, you have to kind of get your 2 cents in so you can figure out what's going on.
Fantastic. How many of these gigs have you been on?
I've been on 23.
Wow. And my follow-up question, and maybe somebody answered this in the very beginning, I came on late, was how do you get this assignment?
Well, I've done this work with 2 organizations. The one is the National Democratic Institute, which is, are you familiar with that? It's a democracy building group. I used to work there, but I did this actually even before I went to work there as a volunteer on some of these. But when I worked there, I went on a lot of them. But then after I left there in 2015, I started observing for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which anyone can apply to do. And they sent, the US is a member of the OSCE, and so there usually are Americans who are part of these delegations, also Canadians, but of course most of them are Europeans. So it just
so these organizations cover all the expenses.
Oh yes.
Involved.
They don't pay you though, but they cover all the expenses.
So it's a volunteer assignment in that sense.
It is.
Well, fantastic, and thank you for telling us about it.
Oh, you're welcome.
Sarah, I think you had a question.
Yes, I just was curious, were you ever at the same place as President Carter was?
I was actually in the West Bank. The Carter Center, it was a joint delegation between NDI and the Carter Center. So Jimmy Carter was part of our delegation, along with many of his children. There were a whole lot of Carters there. Rosalind was there, everybody was there. But I observed an election actually in a different place in Lebanon. And Carter was there also. He was not part of our delegation, but we saw him, and he was working on this stuff as the election period went on. So it was, he's quite, I mean, he's really good at this. And the Carter Center has been, I think, in the forefront. And I have met observers from the Carter Center in other places, because they often send delegations. And usually when you do this, you meet people from different organizations, not just from your organization, but you meet them from other places.
Sort of go out and have dinner with them at night and sort of.
You do, yeah. Yeah. One of the most interesting people I met was a guy from, well, you always ask people, where are you from? And this was a guy who was part of an EU delegation. And he was a large African man. And I said, where are you from? And he said, I'm from Denmark. And I was sort of like, really? And anyway, that was interesting. But I later had a beer with him, and it turned out that he was from, gosh, now I can't remember. I think he was from Cameroon, maybe. And he had been a political dissident, and he was in members of his family had been killed, and they all had to leave the country, and he ended up settling in Denmark, and his job there is resettling refugees. He was a great guy. It was very interesting to meet him.
I'm sure you met a lot of very interesting people.
I
doing
did.
this.
Yeah.
So when you
That's
say,
part of what's fun about it, is that you meet all kinds of different people.
no,
Yes.
I'm just curious again about Carter, because was he very gentle and when he approached these people, or was he, because he's been doing it for years, just like you have, so.
I don't think I saw him in our big meetings. He was among those who would speak and present things. I did not go out with him on a observation, so I don't know how he reacted to the people in the polling stations. But one thing was interesting. So Hamas, this was in 2006, and this may still be true, but anyway, at that time, Hamas was considered a terrorist organization. And our mission was funded by USAID. And so we didn't meet with Hamas during this period, because that was not part of our mission, or I don't know, part of what we were expected to do. But I think Carter was able to meet with them later.
That is interesting. Melody, I see your hand up.
Yeah, hi. It was a very good presentation. It sounded like you really got some great experience in different countries.
Thank you.
I am retired, but I worked at USAID, and I was just wondering, now that I'm retired in that, I'm looking for interesting international opportunities, and I was wondering, do a lot of people apply for this? Would I have a hard time getting on a delegation, or what is the?
I don't really know. I don't know if you were on earlier when I was mentioning, so groups like NDI have relatively small delegations, somewhere in the 30 to 50 range, maybe, sometimes even smaller. Whereas OSCE has our Ukraine delegation that I was on in 2018, or I don't know, anyway, was 600 people.
Wow.
So it depends. There is an organization in Washington that goes by the initials PAE. I'm not sure what it stands for, but they are the recruiters for these missions that take Americans. And so you can apply through them and get on their list, and there's a list of what's coming up and things like that.
Did you say P as in Paul, A as in
P as
Adam,
in Paul, A as in PAE. Yeah. P as in Paul.
P as in Paul, A, E as in Edward?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Thank you. I appreciate that.
What did you do at the State Department?
I worked USAID, and I actually
I'm
worked
sorry.
I worked in many of the countries that you mentioned.
Oh,
So that's why I think that maybe they would think I'm too biased and would not want me, but I don't know.
well, not necessarily. I think it's probably knowledge is good. So
That's what I'm thinking, but we'll see.
And Kathy, when you go over, how long are you usually in the country for?
usually about a week. It depends, but about a week usually. Now, there are other positions that people take, which are long-term observers, and they can be there for 3 months maybe, and will be sent out usually to different regions. And they actually do the organizing work for the most part for the short-term observers, which is what I've been doing. And they will figure out where we stay and who we meet with and all that sort of stuff in the individual areas of the country where we are assigned. I've never done that, but
Very interesting. Are there any other questions for Kathy? I guess I have one. Was there any time when you were doing this that you felt that you were in danger?
I get that question a lot. Really, the only time I ever felt uncomfortable was in the West Bank. I was assigned to an area outside of Hebron, and in order to get to where we were going, we had to go through a refugee camp, both in and out, to get where we were going. And there were a lot of, I mean, it was a very narrow space, and it was kind of a little nerve-wracking that you couldn't bolt if you needed to. And people fire guns in the air and all that. So yeah, that was a little nerve-wracking. But that's about the only time I think that I've felt that way.
Why were they firing guns? I mean,
Well, they fire in the air, you know,
Because
petty
they
stuff,
can.
voting for with this
because
election.
it was
And
voting. Okay.
yeah, it wasn't, I mean, they weren't shooting at anyone, but they were just, you know, letting off steam, I guess.
Okay. Melody, I see you have another question.
Yeah, I just a follow-up question about the mechanics of all this. How much notice, once you're selected, how much notice do you get for preparing to go? Is it a month or weeks or?
It depends. Usually in the information that is provided when you apply, it will say that the short-term observers will be deployed on such and such a date. So, I mean, you know that that's the date. When sometimes you get, so I mentioned earlier that I was in the area in Ukraine in Dnipro, formerly Dnipropetrovsk, which is an area very close to the Donbass where all this Russian activity is going on. And so there was a runoff election. This was a local election, but they had to have a runoff. And so I was asked to go back, would I want to go back for the runoff, which I did. And I don't think I had much notice for that, maybe a week or two. And then I went back again. But I mean, these are the kind of things, having worked for USAID, you probably have been on short notice for things like this. So, I mean, there's not a lot of lead time, but there's enough.
Okay, yeah, no, that would be interesting. It's not like I have so much going on that I need so much lead time, but at the same time, it would be kind of nice. And also, did you get a chance to select the countries you wanted to go to? Or did they say, these are the ones that are available? Do you want to do it?
Well, on the PAE website, if you go there, you will see the list of upcoming elections that you are invited to apply for if you're interested. In the case of NDI, I mean, that was my job, so I just went wherever I could, and I like that, so I was happy to go no matter where. So.
Yeah, I was just thinking because I speak Spanish, and so I was thinking I'd probably be the most useful in the Spanish-speaking country, but we'll see.
Well, the OSCE does, to my knowledge, does not go to South and Central America.
Okay.
Most of their work is in Europe. So,
Okay.
but the OAS probably would be interested in Spanish speakers who would could go and do that.
Okay. I guess I just need to get online and try to Google the PAE and see if I can get a hold of these people.
Mhm.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Kathy, thank you very much. Before we end, I do have regards for you from Cindy Waters. She is now the executive director of Lake Bancroft Village, and we share our information with other villages. Unfortunately, she had her annual town hall meeting tonight, so she couldn't be here. But she said she worked with you for, I think, over 10 years at Senator
She did.
Cohen's office. Yes. So she asked
Oh,
me to
that's
share
great. Well, give her
regards.
my regards, please.
I certainly will. And thank you very much. This has been a really interesting presentation. And
Oh, you're
sounds like
welcome.
you've got some people looking to apply as a result of it. So
Great. Well, I wish you all good luck.
thank you.
Thank you very much.
much.
Okay.
Have a good
Thank
evening,
you.
everyone.
You too.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.